Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our halftime talk feature interview. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mr. Yuri Humber, who is founder of Japan NRG and the CEO of Yuri Group. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Diala.
Great to have you with us. Yuri, will obviously we're going to focus in and talk about Japan. Of course, a country that's had its struggles economically in the last 20, 30 years, seem to have a bit of a slight recovery this year to an extent coming out of that period. But let's focus in and zero in on energy, because again, of course, as a big consumer of energy and a reliance on imports of energy of all sorts, let's talk a little bit and get your views on what strategy Japan is now adopting going forward, particularly in light of new energy transition targets and of course opportunities and options out there in the energy space. Give us just first of all just a view from your point of view. How is Japan's energy sort of outlook looking? How has it changed in the last few years going forward in light of any energy transition targets?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the question. So maybe I should give a little bit of background where sort of Japan's at, that will help maybe frame some of the answers and the conversation. So as the world's coming out of, and probably hopefully mostly come out of the pandemic, Japan is in a fairly good spot in the sense that the economy is starting to sort of be on an upturn. The country managed to deal with the pandemic fairly well, especially on a sort of a comparative basis, and it's got a lot of positives, but there is a very much sort of one let's say negative that is related to energy, and that is that Japan has been sort of on an upward trajectory in terms of the economy, in terms of sort of becoming more advanced on a global stage, politically, geopolitically, and many other things. However, it's one thing that's happened because of the Japanese domestic monetary policy is that the yen has become incredibly weak, among the weakest in sort of 30, 40 years. So you have a yen that right now, I think yesterday was about 149 to the dollar, getting close to 150. And just to give you context, 10 years ago, we would have been talking about the yen being 80 yen to the dollar, right? So you've got this massive shift in the yen, and that makes a big difference also to the energy transition. Now, why? Japan is still one of the world's largest importers of fossil fuels. It's still the #4 importer of crude oil and oil products. It is the biggest importer of LNG at this moment, and even if China overtakes it in the next few years, it will still be a massive importer of that fuel. It's also one of the biggest buyers of coal, mainly from Australia. So all of this is making up about sort of, let's say, 70% of Japan's energy mix. So I'm talking energy rather than just the electricity mix. Of course, all of this energy, if you're importing it, that means, you need your currency to be relatively strong to afford it. If your currency dips to 150, no matter how well your manufacturing sector and the other sectors are going, it's going to have an impact. So quite interestingly, Japan, the price of crude oil is down in terms of what Japan's paying. In dollar terms, it's down about a quarter since a year ago. But in terms of yen price, I should say in dollar terms, it's down by 50%. But in yen terms, it's only down by a quarter. So that has a knock-on effect on several things. One, obviously, for a manufacturing-driven economy, if you are spending more on import energy, then you're not covering quite your exports. So that's sort of the broader macroeconomic picture. But on an energy transition level, it means you're obviously you understand that you need to go forward with the energy transition, and that requires vast amounts of investments.
Yeah.
But you're less, everyone feels less inclined to make big investments when they're not earning as much money, right? So you've seen that with corporates all around the world. You'll see that with governments all around the world, and Japan's no different. The targets that Japan has set are very ambitious, as everyone likes the word ambitious nowadays. I'll use that for Japan too. Sure, if you'd like to if you ask what is the green transition, which is what Japan calls it, the GX, green transition. What is the green transition plan, green transformation plan in Japan over the next 10 years? Well, according to the government, it's sort of spending 150 trillion yen, so, sort of $1.5 trillion, let's say, very, very roughly, on the energy transition all across the economy. That sounds like a huge number, and it sounds like a very sort of good plan until you realize that the government's saying, well, we're not going to provide all of this investment, because clearly, no government could. We're going to provide some of it, but we're hoping that investments will come from other parties. And so this is kind of where you're essentially asking private businesses, both in Japan and outside Japan, to make the investments. But I would say the current situation when the yen is getting so weak, you're going to have a lot more interest from overseas companies looking at the Japanese market and saying, well, there's some great technologies here. There's some very efficient companies. Maybe we want to invest in Japan rather than, say, the Japanese companies sort of putting up that money and maybe doing as much outward investment as before.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Yuri, for painting that very comprehensive picture. Yes, and perhaps you would attract that outside FDI, if you like. As you said, the energy transition does need a lot of funding. Even countries in a better financial position are beginning to retreat from that for different reasons, energy security, etc., wanting to sort of secure the energy that's there in the world to import. And of course, Japan does import a lot of, imports oil, obviously, but also gas, LNG, etc. You touched on LNG. Let's just talk a little bit about that to start off with, as one of the obviously primary sources of your energy. Australia is one of the biggest providers. I think you take about 40% of your LNG from Australia. And obviously it's still obviously a big supplier of LNG. It has been obviously shutting down one or two outfits there, and that has caused Japan some concern. How big a concern is it for Japan's sort of energy security that you're one of the biggest contractual sort of energy suppliers is beginning to sort of reformat to an extent? Obviously, you also import coal from Australia as well. So how is Japan's energy strategy changing to rely perhaps more on Middle Eastern suppliers going forward? Is there much thinking going into that right now?
Thank you. That there's a lot of thinking around this. So let me just give you a few numbers that I think describe the relationship with Australia. So again, we're talking the post-war in Ukraine, but the numbers won't have changed. And then the numbers haven't changed dramatically, to be honest, in the sense. So Australia accounts for 65% of Japan's coal imports. Okay, so pre-war, Russia accounted for about 13% of the coal that Japan bought, and that stake, that market share has obviously dropped. Japan has even vowed to phase out all Russian coal imports, but it hasn't put a deadline on that. It hasn't put a time frame on that, and that is also about, if you're going to phase something out, you need to have an alternative. So that's on the coal front. Now, on the LNG front, the picture is even worse, even if it doesn't quite sound as bad. Australia accounts for 43% of Japan's LNG imports. So that's a huge amount. I'm talking about 2022 numbers. Given how tight the LNG market has been for the last couple of years and is expected to be for at least the next 2 years, we're talking about Japan, the world's largest importer of LNG, a country that imported 72 million tons last year, 43% of that from a single source, Australia. Suddenly, I'm not saying all of that import volume is now under threat, but it's certainly under question a little bit, because we're not talking about the LNG imports today. We're talking about sort of what is going to happen in the longer term. And Japan is a long long-term LNG buyer, right? Japan doesn't really rely on the spot market, in the same way that, say, Europe does, or a lot of other countries. Japan very much relies on long-term contracts for about 80–85% of its import volumes. So, all of this, or the vast majority of this volumes coming out of Australia are based on these long-term contracts. Of course, that means that, when you have a government not only discussing putting tax on sort of projects from now on, but also looking at sort of taxing current projects that are not sort of retrofitted with CCS and so on, then that's going to set off alarm bells. In addition to that, you have the strikes, you have various logistical weather-related issues, not just in Australia, but around the world, Panama Canal, etc.
Yes.
So of course, you suddenly have not only Japanese politicians, but you have sort of the CEO of Inpex, the biggest Japanese investor in LNG in Australia, with that $40 billion project, Inpex, suddenly talking about how they are concerned. And as you know, Japanese companies do not, first of all, don't really publicly talk that much about sort of their, various views, but also certainly don't criticize. They're very careful about, the kind of things they say. So for such an important CEO to come out and say he's concerned about what's going on in Australia, I think, it takes definitely a big thing.
Okay, and then just to expand a bit on that, in terms of there's concerns over Australia. What is the current profile of the reliance on LNG imports from the Middle East of Japan, and why wouldn't it naturally take much more from Qatar already? Why wouldn't it tie itself more into long-term contracts? Is it a price issue? Is it just a conventional sort of relationship issue? Is there a different trajectory going forward for more Middle East supply coming out? And of course, you've got American LNG as well.
Absolutely. So so if you look at the oil picture, then you have about 95% of Japan's oil coming from 6 Middle Eastern nations, right? So there's clearly not an issue with can we or can we not buy from the Middle East. In fact, Japan has been, if anything, it's too reliant on the Middle East for the oil, and has for years looked at sort of a plan B. Unfortunately, that plan B was Russia, and right now that's not a great plan B to have. Now, so why not LNG? Well, traditionally, Japan has been a massive buyer of LNG from the Middle East. And as you may remember, it had some incredibly big volume contracts with Qatar specifically, but also with Oman and with the other suppliers. The difficulty with increasing volumes in the Middle East is that traditionally, Qatar has been very strict, and other Middle Eastern suppliers have been very strict in terms of how the contracts should be structured. So they like things to be fixed and long term. Now, Japan is happy for the long term nature of the contracts to be there, but it needs more flexibility in terms of volumes, how much the offtake is, and where it's delivered. Because the problem is Japan doesn't have a domestic gas pipeline system, right? So if you deliver the LNG to one port, but actually you need it somewhere else, you can't just send it by pipeline. You have to reship it, right? So there's a lot of time cost involved. Now, if the utility a Japanese power utility that's buying the LNG doesn't need it because of weather reasons or other kind of issues, it has a lot less flexibility, or almost zero flexibility in terms of destination, right? Where it can receive the cargoes and so forth. So you'll remember that there was quite a diplomatic storm about a year and a half ago when JERA let go of a 5.5 million ton a year contract with Qatar. I mean, it essentially didn't renew it. And this has been a long sort of 30 plus year contract, right? So of course it was a big deal, and Qatar was very upset. Post the events in Ukraine and the LNG shortages, etc., that have gone on, you've certainly had Japan try to mend the fences on the political front. You had the Prime Minister Kishida visit to the Middle East a couple of months ago, right? Visited Qatar, visited Saudi Arabia, visited UAE. And of course, the idea is that Japan would like to continue buying the oil and the LNG. However, there has to be more flexibility, because one of the reasons is, of course, the energy transition. I think very few people could predict exactly what's going to happen to Japan's demand within sort of 10, 15 years, which is what you need on an LNG contract basis, right? You not only have depopulation, you also have, sort of changing trends in power generation. So a lot more solar and wind, like in other countries, coming onto the grid, where you've got more variable renewables, then you obviously have a lot less forecastability around how much of the big fuels, if you say the traditional fuels, you need. So, the utilities, the big power utilities in Japan, which are now competing in an open market with solar farms and soon, offshore wind farms and so on, they say, look, we don't want to take on this huge sort of financial risk of a long-term large LNG contract where we have no flexibility, right? So that's why the Middle East should be a really big supplier for Japan, and is to a point, but it's definitely not using up the potential because of the contract structures.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah, because obviously it would be great if Japan could rely a bit more on spot LNG buying. Obviously, that's a bit more expensive than contracts, but it gives it that flexibility, as you said, as it works through its strategy to energy transition. Of course, every country has that, and that trickles down to how much investments even going into upstream, into these conventional, I suppose, types of energy versus energy transition. Yuri, that's very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about power generation. You touched on that. Obviously, that's a big part of why Japan imports energy, and of course, you've got your traditional sort of power generation fuels, but this co-firing is gaining a bit more attention in terms of using, hydrogen, ammonia, sort of new, cleaner fuels in combination, though, still with coal. As far as Japan is concerned. Tell us a bit about what the real advantage there is in that solution, because does it not sort of still engage us in coal, which is a dirty fuel? And from a cost point of view, is it an advantage to bring in these new sort of co-firing solutions?
So let me give you just a very quick analogy. The Japanese National Stadium took about 3 or 4 years to build, and it's a massive stadium, right? So this is a huge sports arena. A little tiny 10-meter bridge next door to my house has taken so far 6 or 7 years to rebuild and is still not finished. So why can we rebuild? Can we build an entirely new stadium in 3 years, but can't sort of rebuild a tiny bridge in 6, 7 years? And the answer is because the site of the stadium can be shut down. No one's using it, okay? And we could just build on it anytime, any day of the week. But the bridge is vital. You can't shut it down. If you shut down the bridge, then no traffic is able to pass. It's a major sort of thoroughfare. So the same thing with the energy transition and, what Japan argues. We can't just turn off electricity for, let's say, 12 months and say, you know what, we're not going to use any electricity. Let's just build an entirely new clean grid, et cetera, right? So based on the fact that you have to maintain 24/7 electricity at the right cost, at the right price, and so on, and you have already an entire energy system built, Japan's position is, well, how do we move towards where we want to be, but make sure that there is a transition? Because let's face it, we are talking about an energy transition, not an entire switch. And that means, it's more cost effective because Japan's coal power plants are also much, much younger than they are in Europe and the US. So average age of a coal power plant in the US is about 40 years. In Japan, it's about 20 years or less. And in Southeast Asia, it's like 10 years, right? So you built them fairly recently. You can't just shut it down economically. Secondly, using hydrogen for power generation or ammonia for power generation is still a fairly recent thing. So while Japan has done the tests and is actually doing sort of trial tests on a more, let's say, bigger scale commercial level right now, you still need to build the entire supply chain. Like we have an LNG industry, but that industry wasn't built in just a year or two, right? That took decades to build out. So even if we use similar suppliers, so again, the Middle East with the natural gas, steam reforming to turn the natural gas into hydrogen or ammonia, of course, with the carbon capture technology in place, even if we move that route, you still will take time and investment to be able to produce the volumes that is required for a full power plant in Japan to burn just ammonia. If a Japanese coal power plant switched entirely from coal to ammonia, I think it would, just one coal power plant would probably double Japan's ammonia imports, just like that, right? So the volumes we're talking about is huge. Then you need to think about, well, how are you going to store this ammonia? You need much bigger storage tanks. All of these things have to be built. And then, of course, on top of that, the very, very important question for everyone is price, right? Obviously, when you start low volumes, the price is high. Middle East suppliers in Saudi Arabia, the UAE are very happy to supply Japan with blue ammonia right now, but the prices they're quoting is still quite high. In fact, still quite high. But it is, as I talked about the weak yen earlier, not only that, but it's in general, it's the high price. So for a power utility that is competing in an electricity market and is still selling electricity at pretty much the same price as everyone else, that's a tough sell. Now, so why even go that route, right? Yeah. What's the advantage? The advantage is just, Japan has looked at its terrain. First of all, Japan has built an incredible amount of solar power in the last decade, which it very rarely gets any credit for. It has the world's third largest capacity in solar, right? Which is not bad for a country of, 120 million people, and mainly mountainous, right? So you don't have that available flat land that you might have in the desert or in the plains. So it's already built a lot of solar, and while it has plans to build more, I think there is a general recognition that they're starting to bump into a lot of issues, social pushback. I mean, communities are against, and so on and so on. So you have to have other solutions. You can't just hope that you're going to be able to fill every inch of land and rooftop with solar and that will do it. Plus, there's also the intermittent nature of solar and wind that no one has yet been able to overcome. So Japan's sort of response is, what other energy pathway makes sense? We're not saying we'll switch the entire country to hydrogen and ammonia, but we think it will play a big role in basically shifting let's say, moving away from coal. And that process is going to be gradual, but I think that once you see it at a couple of power plants working on a regular basis, it'll accelerate. And then it'll be a pretty swift, 4 or 5 year transition. But at the beginning, it's going to take time for all the issues that I've outlined.
Yeah, absolutely. The building up to scale is always a big question mark, isn't it? In a lot of these transition technologies and solutions. Well, let's conclude with a point on nuclear power then, Yuri, because that is something that is available today. It is a technology that has been used by Japan. Of course, you had the Fukushima disaster and shutdowns after that, but you have had reactors being brought back into action in the last, let's say, 10 years or so, with plans to reactivate and restart more of those. Give us your view on the outlook there for sort of re-engaging nuclear power into the energy equation.
Right. So 2011, major, one of the world's worst nuclear disasters. Was all the the nuclear power plants in Japan got shut down. Not immediately, but over time they got shut down. In Japan, there is a sort of a process. It's not exactly a legal process, but it is a social process, which is the regulator says when the reactor can be turned back on based on safety checks. But it's up to the local village, the local town, to the local governor to give the green light. If they don't, then the power utility cannot turn the reactor back on, right? Again, this is not a legal sort of point, but it is something that is seen as socially important. So for years after the Fukushima accident, there was very strong anti-nuclear feeling in Japan. So of course, most communities were against, and politicians just didn't want to push the issue. What have they got to gain from it? So the prime minister at the time, even though he was super popular, Prime Minister Abe, just barely ever mentioned nuclear. He was pro-nuclear, but he very rarely talked about it, and he knew it was just one of those thorny issues. Now, I do think 10 years on, we've had more than 10 years now, and there is a sort of let's say, a certain mourning period has passed. That helps. There is also the energy crisis that ensued after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You suddenly have a lot of moving geopolitical pieces that make people change their mind. You have power prices doubling, more than doubling in Japan, right? Because of the increased cost of the coal and the gas and so on. So in that situation where people are looking at their power bill going up and concerned about energy supply security, there is a certain sense that, well, maybe nuclear isn't so bad. There has been a swing back towards pro-nuclear mood in the country in the last year, maybe year and a half. And the government has finally started to talk openly that it is pro-nuclear, that it, of course, believes that nuclear, safety first, etc., but it would like to bring nuclear back into the fold. At this moment, however, there are many challenges to getting the nuclear industry back to, let's say, where it was or anywhere near where it was pre the Fukushima accident. One is that, again, probably social reasons, all the reactors that have been restarted in Japan are in Western Japan. And, Fukushima, if you like, is northeast. So absolutely no reactors that are in the east of the country have been restarted. Now, partly that it could be explained by a few, technical things, but really it's about sort of getting over
political.
Yeah.
Political. Social and political.
Yeah, it's social. And so until we see that sort of step taken, I don't think we can talk about a wholesale nuclear revival in the country.
Okay. And that's, again, one of many solutions, and many other countries are taking the same approach. They may have not had the same event, disaster that they had with Fukushima. But I mean, look, here in the Gulf, the UAE is investing in nuclear. You would argue,
right.
It doesn't need to. It has other sources, but it is a sort of multi-pronged approach, isn't it? And with the Russia situation, although Europe really has been mainly impacted by that, I think there is a new approach to sort of energy security, diversity, if you like, more so than before, and incorporating the energy transition into that on a step-by-step basis. Yuri Humber, founder of Japan NRG and CEO of the Yuri Group. Sorry, we've run out of time. Very interesting to talk to you today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.